Good afternoon, everyone. This is Terry Coyne from Eden Technologies. I'm so glad you could join us today. Before we get started, I just want to mention that we are right by Penn Station, so you might hear the sound of a train whistle going off. We are not actually in Penn Station, although it may sound that way. You may also hear some construction noise, but that usually dies down around now. They're building some office towers by us. All right, that said, we're so glad you could join us today for our webinar on the fundamentals of data governance. And I'm really happy to have our Eden data security expert.
Hi, I'm Andy Sherman, security practice lead at Eden Technologies, and this is data governance, despite the not so compelling sounding name, is one of my passions.
And you know, few people can say data governance is their passion,
right.
So we're lucky to have you. My name's Terry Coyne. For those of you that have not been on a webinar before, I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications, and I head up our Learning and Communications practice. And my experience in IT has been really driving user adoption and raising awareness and educational efforts. So you'll always hear me jumping in on anything it's about. We need to explain this to people. So a little bit about Eden, if you're not familiar with us. We've been in business for over 11 years, and we pride ourselves on having a deep level of expertise in projects that are really transformational, IT transformation projects. That's what we call them. We've really kind of made our name in widespread global OS migration, and in doing that, we started to branch out into the areas of data and network security, because it's really right now the perfect storm. Organizations are really seriously looking at this, and our experience from all those different perspectives really gives us a unique and nice advantage in the marketplace. So let's talk about enterprise data security. We're really feeling like this is going to be a hot topic for people, and based on the people that have signed up for the webinar, this is a hot topic for people right now. This is what we call our wheel of data security, or optimized data security. You want to just talk a little bit about what we mean by these different things?
These are all the components of an effective data security, in a lot of ways, any effective risk management program. And starting with governance, in this case with data governance, with risk assessment, regulatory stuff, classification policies, through and awareness and communication. So of this big wheel, we are going to focus on the first slice up at the upper right today. It's on data governance. And a little bit on data classification also, because that's actually a part of data governance.
Well, and I'm also going to throw in, we're always going to be talking about awareness and communication.
Of course.
Okay, so let's just level set. What is data governance? What's your definition of data governance?
So data governance is a set of processes by which you determine who owns data, how sensitive it is, and who should have access to it.
Okay, that seems simple. So at the core, when we talk about governance, where does it come from? What's the difference between what's IT's governance responsibility and what's the organization's governance?
Okay, so IT has a role in data governance, but IT is not the be-all and end-all of it. Data governance, it's all the people, processes, and technology involved in handling important data assets. You know, data is an asset, and we're going to get to that in the next slide as well. It's important to remember that. And so all of the people involved in managing that asset are part of the data governance structure.
Okay.
So if you take nothing else away from this talk out there in Radio Land, this is it, right? This is what I consider the fundamental axiom of data governance, which is that data is a business asset. And therefore, data governance and data security are business problems, not technology problems, although they involve technology. And they should be tied to the overarching business strategy of the organization. right? And there are two important corollaries to this. One is that as IT people, the best thing that we should be doing is creating the climate and implementing systems that empower the business to manage data properly themselves, consistent with them getting their jobs done. And the other corollary is that if we inject ourselves unnecessarily into the governance processes, for example, by having system administrators attempt to make access control decisions, that in general, the outcome is going to be that we're going to slow down the process, the governance process, and we're going to screw it up because we don't have the knowledge to know who really should have access to data.
I completely agree with you, but I also have to say, one of the struggles I think we all have in IT around this idea is, one, if there isn't a clear path of ownership, if there isn't clarity on that front, and there isn't an understanding, a real understanding that data is a business asset, it's often, the impression is that it's that system administrator's
right, the file
responsibility.
system, fix it.
Yeah, just like make sure nobody who isn't supposed to have this doesn't have this. And that's what I think really...
Or more likely, make sure Fred has it.
Right, and so that's what starts to trip people up in these initiatives. So, you know, in taking a big step back, you cannot underestimate the power of agreeing to even that first bullet point.
Right.
Let's just all agree data is a business asset, it's a widget, it's a product, it's something that we're producing that's unique to us that needs to be protected.
Yes.
So, once we've all decided that, now what are the three pillars of data governance? These are sort of the foundational elements you need to have.
Right. So let's start with actually the foundation of our little temple there, and that is policy and guidelines. So governance is always foundational. So if you have a governance process, what's foundational for that is the overall governance of the organization. Policies and guidelines are the way that management tells the rest of us what's important and what the rules are. All right? And everything has to rest on that, because if you don't have policy, you have no basis for doing any of this stuff. Right?
So have you had experiences where you've worked with customers where they have the technology, but there isn't really a significant or an important policy or guideline to drive?
No, it may not be mature.
It may not be mature. Okay.
Right.
So most people have a general sense of what they're trying to accomplish and what their posture is.
Right, but the policies need to be mature, and they need to be definitely tied to these processes. You know, and most enterprises are a lot better at that now than they were 10, 15 years ago. So, and understanding how those things interconnect. So the three pillars are ownership, classification, and access control. So let's start with ownership. Right? Fundamental principle is every piece of data needs an owner. Right? And in a business setting, the owner is the business owner of the data. And that's not necessarily the person who created a piece of content, right? But data is part of the business process.
Right.
And the data owner is the process owner, right? Who in the business owns this process? Now, the other important thing to note is the business owner may delegate this responsibility, but that's a decision. You know, that's a governance decision made by the owner that, okay, I am giving my power to so-and-so to act on my behalf. But the owner or delegate is the ultimate authority for all subsequent governance decisions.
Okay, and once you've established that, some of the tools that we'll be talking about later will help you document that.
Right.
Will help you manage that and report that.
Figure it out.
Figure it out, yes.
Okay, so who do we, you know, who's involved in this? We have authorities, data governance authorities, and those a cross-section of stakeholders who are responsible for setting policy and standards by which you execute a data governance program, and then the data stewards are the people who are actually doing it. And the challenge, the biggest single challenge for ownership, and I would say the biggest single challenge for data governance, once you get beyond the recognize that it's a business problem stage, is identifying who owns data. Most enterprises who have start out have terabytes or petabytes of data sitting and spinning, and not many clues about who actually owns the different collections. File system metadata by itself is usually inconclusive. It usually tells you who created something, not who owns it, as opposed to what's the business process associated with that data and who owns it. Real ownership reflects the organizational structure and responsibilities in the enterprise. Probably the biggest single clue, technological clue, to identifying the owners of data is looking at who uses it, right? And the communities of interest around usage of data collections, tells you whose data it is, and then you find the senior people in that group, and that somewhere in there is the owner or owners.
So this is a big challenge.
Yeah.
So let's just say you have done this. I know who my owner is. Now I need to go to my owner.
Or even for my first little collection,
I have a little collection, and I know who the owner is. So now I'm going to go to the next pillar, which is the classification.
Right. So we have our collection of data. Not everything in it has the same sensitivity or requires the same level of protection. And you need to match the protection level around data to how sensitive it is, so the crown jewels get appropriately protected, and the stuff that's supposed to be public actually is accessible by people who need it.
Right.
Enterprises need a clear and consistent taxonomy that everybody uses. This should be set by policy. Policy should say, this is what this classification means, and this is how you handle it. Actually, assigning a classification to something is ultimately the obligation of the data owner. Hi, you own this data. Now you have a job to do.
Right.
And it's important to get it right because it drives the outcomes under policy, right? You assign it this classification, that has these implications for what the handling rules are. And it drives technology choices and methods in protecting the data. Right, so who's involved? The data governance authorities in setting up the rules, custodians and stewards and end users at various stages in the life cycle of a piece of content in assigning and maintaining the classification on it and obeying the rules and how it's handled.
Yeah, I can definitely say, the organizations that do a good job in defining the classifications and they have the owner, it often falls short with effectively communicating the classifications to everyone from the data stewards to the end users.
Right.
End users, depending on how intrusive this classification process can be, need to understand what those implications are and what the classifications are and how to use them appropriately. And that isn't just a one-time email that goes out to everyone in the organization.
No,
it really needs to be part of an overreaching security awareness program.
Should be part of the annual awareness.
Yes, absolutely.
Comes up every year. Okay, so let's look at a model schema. This is I'd say a model schema for the private sector. The government would have much more things in it and would be applied paragraph by paragraph. Mm-hmm. So the classes, what's the taxonomy? It's from public, which is the least sensitive, through internal use only, confidential, and restricted is the most sensitive. I've worked for one organization where that meant copies of paper documents were numbered, and you signed for it and then returned it when you no longer needed it. This classification scheme is risk-based, meaning that it depends on what is the risk of disclosure of the document, or the collection of data. So that can be risk to clients if it's client-related data that's contained in there. The risk to the business, either monetary or regulatory, if the data is disclosed, or the risk to the reputation of the enterprise when it becomes public that the data was breached. And notice I said when, not if, because if you have a breach of many kinds of data, there's no way it can be kept under wrap because you have obligations to disclose.
Right.
Next.
Okay, so now we know who the owner is. We know how we're going to classify it. What is the next piece?
The next piece is to control access. And just about any data classification other than public is going to require that access be restricted. How much depends on how sensitive it is and how broad the need to know is in the organization. We have basic rights to the data. I generally put them into two groups, the read group and the modify group. Read, execute, and copy versus modify and delete. Various operating systems may have that much more granular than that, but those are the two sorts of groups of rights. Access rights can be role-based or can be individually managed. The right answer is yes to that, because in general, role-based entitlements are more efficient to manage because you assign the entitlement to the role, and then people acquire or lose those rights as they move in and out of roles. And it's a much more coherent strategy than saying, okay, he's working here today, now he needs these extra rights.
Right.
With role-based rights, you actually have a much better chance of making sure people lose rights when they no longer need them.
Absolutely.
As long as they're taken out of the role that needed them. Versus individually managed. However, you will never get away from individually managed entitlements because no rule-based system is perfect. And no rule-based system is without exceptions.
Right.
And so any policy-driven process needs built into the process an exception management procedure. And for access rights, that's granting individual rights that go beyond what comes from a user's role. You need a good workflow for granting and revoke requests, either to a role or to an individual right. These should involve the ultimate decision being with the business owner of the data or a delegate. And notice that we need a process both for granting and for revoking access.
Yes.
Most enterprises are really, really good at granting access when it's needed and not so good at revoking it. And I would say these processes work best when they're automated so that when a decision is made, the rights get provisioned fairly quickly so that you don't introduce a lot of friction in how people do their jobs. Right? This is meant to enhance work, not inhibit it. Okay?
Absolutely. The value of a good governance with oversight is even if you have a good revoke process, there are always things that slip through the cracks. And this gives you that opportunity to periodically go back and say,
recertify.
Why did she have access to
Right.
that, or when did that happen? And to also keep a close eye on it, and it also helps you review your roles. Is there a new role? Are we granting certain access to this group of people consistently?
Right.
Maybe we
if you have a lot of exceptions, that could indicate that you need to add a role.
Right. So it's a really good way to stay on top of that.
Yeah. And who does this? Again, it's our usual cast of characters. The data governance authorities set the rules, and the custodians and stewards actually execute on them.
Okay, this all sounds great. You know,
Hey,
like,
piece of
okay,
cake.
got it. I can have this all taken care of within a month. Not. Each one of these pillars comes with
A lot of work.
A lot of work and some serious challenges. So let's talk about those challenges.
All right. All right, the biggest challenge is, all right, so it's lunchtime. You know where your data is. So your data is at risk. That's probably a tautology.
Yes.
Most organizations don't know who's responsible for data. Even data owners don't know where their data is, how it's classified, who really should have access, who really does have access, which is usually an even bigger surprise. And 80%, and a lot of the focus of what we're talking about is on the 80% of corporate data that's unstructured, right? Structured data, which by that I mean data that's sitting in relational databases with access controlled by applications. The entitlements to that are usually better managed, especially over the past decade or so as part of a lot of corporate governance regulation that came down after the first crash. That there's been a lot more focus on entitlements to data and applications. For unstructured data, not so much. And that's where not only is 80% of the data, but a whole lot of the risk. is in piles and piles of unstructured data, largely uncontrolled, and largely growing at this huge rate of 650% over the next 5 years.
Can you give us an example of unstructured data?
Sure. Collection of spreadsheets and Word documents sitting on a file share or sitting in SharePoint. Loosely controlled, if at all. Right? Sensitive data in an open share. This is a big data governance problem in a lot of organizations.
And again, going back to your comment, in the situations where the data resides in databases, there's usually some controls around that. But how much data is pulled out of those databases into spreadsheets?
Extracted into spreadsheets.
And now you think you've got that data locked down through your access control in that database, but that data is coming out in dozens and dozens of Excel spreadsheets, as you said,
sitting in the file system.
And this is reflective of how people are working now, and the need to just sort of collect different pieces of data from a wide variety of sources and the volume of documents people touch every day.
Yeah, and to dispel one myth, SharePoint didn't solve this problem.
No.
SharePoint in some ways made the access control problem worse because it distributed it out in ways that may or may not make sense depending on how you set it up. So SharePoint turned out to be a bigger attic.
Absolutely, absolutely. So now that we've totally overwhelmed the situation, let's talk a little bit about whether or not you already have, and most organizations have some form of data governance already in play. Right. The key here is how do you optimize, or how do you get to the next level? I'm just going to throw in as the first bullet point, you must raise the awareness and educate. As you're saying, the tools can do a lot of things, but without that sort of agreed upon understanding and awareness that data is a business asset, that most of our data is unstructured, and we need ownership over this data, all these tools can only take you so far.
Right, and then it's everybody's job to protect it.
It's everybody's job. It's everybody's job in the organization.
And then this is, optimizing your data governance. This is an iterative process, and the earlier you are in this, the more frequent the iterations. As you work your way into it, you need to define the rules and policies. You need to apply them to some subset of what you've got. Start by finding your quick wins. Some huge open share. Figure out who owns it. Start cleaning up. Find the issues with whatever structure you set up around this. Fix them. Turn the crank again, and go back to the top. Figure out what needs to be refined in your rules and processes because you're still making them up, and then go through it again. This is, to use my favorite analogy, it's like painting a bridge. When you get to the end, it's time to go back to the beginning and start again. And in the case of an early data governance program, you're painting really fast.
Yeah, and I think your point of the early win, easy wins, low-hanging fruit, big pain points, you want to start with something that really is you think you're going to be able to get control of relatively easily. You can use it to raise awareness, and then you can demonstrate efficacy.
Right.
The other thing I just want to stress, too, is once you locate that data, let's just say it's data on a certain share, you need to try to understand how that data got there and how users are working with the data. Before you start applying policies and a procedure and classification and access control, start with why are they doing this to begin with. Quite often, sometimes it's something that if you could just make a change in the database, they'll stop taking the data out of the database.
Right.
So it's not always a big high-tech solution. It's understanding why did they do it to begin with.
Yeah, there's also the holy cow moment when people said, we've got what sitting where.
Right. Absolutely, because again it goes back to you don't really know where your data is. Okay, so let's talk about some of the vendors that are in this space and some of the ways you can use some of the tools.
You know, and 7, 8 years ago, the slide would have been a lot sparser than it is now. There's been, the past year or two, an uptick of activity in this space. The foundational players who really created the technology space are certainly still in here. So for ownership, which is generally done by usage audit, automating usage audit, and then finding how the users cluster. So we have 4 players in that now: Varonis, Symantec, Dell through their Quest acquisition, and StealthBits. And similarly, in access control, we have Varonis, Dell Quest, and StealthBits. In the classification, the players cluster differently. So we have 2 content-based players, you know, and probably you could say some of the other DLP players as well. And that's Varonis and Symantec. But we really limited ourselves to players who did something else in the governance scheme as well, besides DLP. Varonis and Symantec, and then we have Titus, which solves the other part of the problem is right up front when you create content, right? Having to crawl the file system to identify it, right? You have to do that because you have this huge legacy sitting out there. But if you could get ahead of the problem when you create content and put a classification on it from your taxonomy, that'd be really useful, and that's what Titus does. You know, for a wide variety of spaces. Probably I would say the 2 biggest are for Microsoft Office and for email, Outlook and Lotus. But also they have tools for just anything in your file system and for mobile.
And again, you cannot roll something like that out without an end user awareness.
Oh yeah. So if you're going to change the way people use a tool they use every day, you really need to do some heavy-duty awareness first.
Absolutely.
But the nice thing about that tool actually is it enhances the ability of some of the others of a DLP tool by giving you definitive metadata to look for.
Absolutely, and that's something that if you're looking at optimizing strategies, this is where you really start to mature your process. Right. These are not separate initiatives. Like if we look at the wheel, it all kind of starts to come together. What can we do with data governance to get DLP more effective, to just look at the whole process and life cycle of your data?
Yeah, so yeah, there's no shortage of tools. These are all great players. But it's not just about the tooling, right? Yeah, 80% of it is getting the people and process right so that the tools actually deliver effectiveness for you.
Absolutely, and we find when we work with customers, no matter where they are on that maturity matrix, that's just a lot of what we're doing is pointing out, okay, but let's go back and look at the process. Let's go back and look at the policy. How should these tools be reflective and support your policy or your process or the people that are impacted by it? If you really have that focus and you don't lose sight of those 3 things, you can get pretty far down the field with some success in taking care of and overseeing some of this critical business data. Do you have anything else on your mind? Anyone on the phone that has any questions? We're getting to the half-hour mark, but if anything's on anyone's mind, feel free to post a question. I'm just going to ask Andy now. Is there anything else that you would add to this? We covered a lot of territory quickly.
I would say, back to the axiom, you need to work with the business stakeholders to get this right. Right? It's their data, and in general, you know, once you get their attention that this is their problem or their joint problem with you, they can really tell you what the rules should be.
Yeah, and I would just add to that communication in the way you're approaching the subject is really critical. There is some resistance to even people that know they own the data, to kind of being told, but now you're responsible for the security.
Hey, that's what I say to my IT guys.
Right, exactly. And there is that feeling that, well, what is IT doing if they're not protecting our data? So there's some suggestions we can make and, or help you out with, but it's really a factor of how you're going to approach it, how you start that conversation, and again, what the implications are, and how that supports your overreaching corporate security posture. If you can come at it from that perspective, I think you can get a lot more leverage that way. All right, well, we're at the half-hour mark. I know everyone is really busy protecting their data, so we don't want to keep people from their mission. Andy, thank you so much.
This has been a pleasure, Terry.
You were right when you said that data governance was your passion. But I've also heard you talk about DLP, and that's pretty passionate. I would venture to say data security, or security in general, is your passion. Thank you so much. We do have some more information we'll be sending out to you guys on the phone. If you would like a copy, a PDF of this deck, let us know when we reach out to you, and we're happy to send it to you. We've also recorded this, so there'll be an archive of that. And as always, please feel free to reach out to either Andy or myself if you have any additional questions, or if you have any thoughts of any topics around any of these data security topics that you want us to do a deeper dive into. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. We really appreciate it, and we'll hopefully see you again on the next Eden webinar. Thanks. Thanks, Andy.